Welcome, everybody. Welcome to JCC Manhattan and to 6 days that shaped 50 years, an I Engage conference on the legacy of the past and future of modern Israel. I am Rabbi Abigail True, Director of the Center for Jewish Living and the Sonnenbend Center for Israel here at the JCC. And I'm deeply grateful to be here with all of you today. I'm deeply grateful to our partners at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, whose faculty will guide our questions and conversations today, and whose staff has been working tirelessly along with my staff, Rabbi Miriam Weinberg and Rachel Kunstadt here at the JCC to make this program happen. And to our good friends, Sheila Lambert and Karen Lehman Eisner, for your support of the JCC Hartman Partnership. To UJA Federation of New York for making this program and so many other wonderful things happen at the JCC and at Hartman. Just a few weeks ago, I was on the phone. I found myself on the phone with a reporter doing a piece on JCC's Yom HaAtzmaut celebrations, the three-day extravaganza, which is the Upper West Side celebrates Israel. And, well, it's a celebration. It's Yom HaAtzmaut. It's a celebration of the miracle of 69 years of a Jewish state. So this reporter was noting the celebratory air, and she says to me, well, it's like the Disneyification of Israel. I had to ask her to repeat it. I didn't understand the word. She said the Disneyification of Israel. What she meant was that for many American Jews, this is her words, not mine, for many American Jews, the Israel is like Disneyland. It's that place over there that you go away, the Jewish theme park you go to for vacation. And while I get what she means, I also know that that's not really our community. Today is not about Israel as Disneyland. Today is about living with and wrestling with imperfection. Having celebrated Yom HaAtzmaut, we come together to say, celebrate, yes, but that's not all. We have questions. We have heartaches. We don't know what to do with the legacy of the Six-Day War, of 50 years of its aftermath unfolding. We are here to grapple with what it means to be American Jews, to be Zionists, and what we make of the legacy of the Six-Day War and the 50 years since. The text that came to me this morning is the teaching of Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Hanina, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Students of the sages, Talmidei Chachamim, students of wisdom, increase peace in the world. And the play of that text between the Banayich, the children, the students, the learners, and the Bonayich, the builders. The idea of the text being that our learning builds peace in the world. And it is in that spirit that our learning together today should be part of our work in the world of bringing peace to Israel, to the Palestinians, to the Middle East, to the world, that I am pleased to open our conference today. To begin our studies then, to begin our building of peace, it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker to open the program, Yossi Klein Halevi, who is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and author of Like Dreamers, the story of the Israeli paratroopers who reunited Jerusalem and divided a nation, among many, many other achievements. We're glad to have you here, Yossi. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here for many reasons, one of which is this is my last talk at the end of a long lecture series. So I'm going home tonight, back into Trump's visit and Yom Yerushalayim. So my topic today is how the Six-Day War transformed our relationship to power, to the land of Israel, and to God. Nothing less than power, land, and God. And my starting point, if I can speak personally, because in the end, I think our relationship to all of these questions is personal. My first encounter with Israel is in the summer of 1967. I'm 14 years old, boy from Brooklyn, from Borough Park, those of you who've heard of it. And my father, who was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, and who had two brothers who had survived the war and were living in Israel, and whom he hadn't seen since the war, suddenly can't keep away from Israel a moment longer and must see his brothers. And so we get on a plane at the end of June 1967, and we land in the middle of not just euphoria, but the happy ending of Jewish history. Some of you will recall Fukuyama's short-lived theory about the end of history from the 1990s. We experienced a Jewish version of the end of history in the summer of 1967. There was in Israel the prevailing certainty that we had just fought our last war, that surely the Arab world would never dare question Israel's strength, existence again. And it was just a matter of time before peace negotiations begin. We felt that we were seeing, that we had witnessed the end of the threats to Jewish existence, and that we were the privileged generation to see the culmination of the Jewish story. We were the victors of Jewish history, not just of the Six-Day War. That summer was the beginning of mass Jewish tourism or pilgrimage to Israel. Until then, relatively very few diaspora Jews had visited Israel. The summer of '67, there are hundreds of thousands of Jews from around the world converging on Israel. And this shared impulse that we had was the need to touch Israel's radiance. We simply had to be there and experience Israel at this transcendent moment. And to understand, those of you who remember those days will certainly appreciate this, but for those of you who were not alive in May 1967, there was a profound sense of existential threat that united Jews around the world. And I remember a series of multiple shocks from May 1967, and it began with watching crowds demonstrating in the streets of Cairo and Damascus, chanting "Death to Israel, death to the Jews," waving placards imprinted with skulls and crossbones. And when I began writing like dreamers, I asked myself whether that memory was contrived or whether there really had been posters, banners with skulls and crossbones. And I went into the archives, I found the photographs. And so the first shock that I experienced and that I think reverberated throughout the Jewish world was that the Holocaust had not exhausted the genocidal threat against the Jewish people. The second shock was realizing how alone we were. The United States, which had promised Israel after the Suez War in 1956 to stand with Israel if the Straits of Tiran, Israel's southern shipping route, would be blockaded again. The Straits are blockaded by Nasser. The United States says, sorry, we're preoccupied with Vietnam. France, Israel's closest ally at that time, it was not yet the United States. The special relationship that we had was with France. France turns against Israel at its most desperate moment. The third shock of those days was the worthlessness of international guarantees to Israel. Nasser orders UN peacekeeping forces to pull out of the Sinai, and they pull out without any deliberation in the Security Council, without any seeming concern in the international community. And in my innocence, I had assumed that peacekeeping forces are in place for precisely such a moment, to prevent what was about to happen. And so Israel is facing an existential threat alone without international guarantees. Israel, until June 1967, had a tenuous relationship to power. It was 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. It was an embattled, largely agrarian society. And the Israel that emerges 3 weeks later, in June 1967, is suddenly the undisputed superpower of the Middle East. And I'll come back soon to the psychological implications of that sudden shift. Now, I experienced personally something of my own miraculous transformation from May 1967 to June 1967 that summer. The photos that I have of my trip, and I spent 2 months in Israel. At the beginning of that trip, I'm short, pale, a little pudgy, not quite sure how to hold myself. By the end of that trip, the photos show a tanned, more self-confident young man, and miraculously, that was the summer of my growth spurt. So I had this Zionist empowerment in my own physical being. And I came home back to Brooklyn reluctantly. I told my father, you go home and I'm staying here for high school, which seemed to me a reasonable idea. And my father said no, and I said yes, and you know how it turned out. So I returned to Brooklyn at the end of the summer, taller, tan, and slimmer, and wearing a bullet around my neck. And I'm wearing a bullet because that's what Israeli teenage boys were wearing in the summer of 1967. Now, what was that bullet? What does that bullet represent? In one sense, the bullet is an understandable reaction of the son of a Holocaust survivor to the collective experience of reprieve from another destruction, that sense of relief. And yet, people who feel secure with power don't have to flaunt it. You don't have to wear a bullet around your neck if you believe that you have an adequate supply of ammunition. And so there's something, a deep insecurity that is reflected by young Israelis that summer who think that they're projecting self-confidence and power, but are actually, I believe, projecting the reverse. I would argue that in our relationship to power, we are a bipolar people. And I want to juxtapose a few dates to make that point. 1945 to 1948. We move from the lowest point in our history, the most powerless moment, 3 years later, regained sovereignty. And the ingathering of the exiles, as we call it, begins, and we win our first military victory. May 1967, June 1967, a kind of psychological replay of 1945 to 1948. And then June 1967, October 1973. When the Yom Kippur War happens, the Israeli public goes back into despair. So we're constantly veering between redemption and destruction, apocalypse. If the Jewish people was a patient in therapy, we know what the diagnosis would be. And I know this for myself. I'm constantly weighing, as an Israeli, constantly asking myself, and not necessarily consciously, but is this a May 1967 moment, or is this a June 1967 moment? Is this a moment where we are really existentially threatened, or is this a moment where we can relax and really work from a place of self-confidence and power? Is Israeli power permanent, or is this a brief interlude between protracted periods of powerlessness? That really is the question that has not been resolved by 1967, at least not in the Jewish psyche. I would divide the Jewish people today in relation to 1967 into two camps. There are the Jews of May 1967 and the Jews of June 1967. The Jews of May 1967 have as their primary memory, either direct memory or vicariously, of 1967, those days of aloneness, of vulnerability, of betrayal, the realization that power is always conditional. We could find ourselves facing a new constellation of power, and the superpower of the Middle East could be reduced in its dimensions. June 1967 Jews have as their starting point the victory of 1967. And they argue that we cannot allow May 1967 and the feelings of vulnerability to in effect, impose themselves on a new reality. Think of Israel in 1967, a small, embattled country, barely 3 million people, and think of Israel today, not just in terms of its high-tech success, but Israel is well on its way to containing an absolute majority of world Jewry. Today, we are 44% of the Jewish population in the world. These were statistics that were just released on Independence Day in Israel. And if current demographic trends continue, both in Israel and in the diaspora, we are very soon approaching the tipping point when an absolute majority of world Jewry will live in the state of Israel. And so June 1967 Jews argue it's time for us to take yes for an answer. It's time for us to acknowledge and to celebrate that Zionism achieved the success that it set out to. It fulfilled its promise of empowerment to the Jewish people. And with empowerment comes moral responsibility. Most of all, taking responsibility for the consequences of June 1967, ruling over another people for the last 50 years. To take this one step further, each of these camps, the May camp and the June camp, has a different source of anguish related to 1967. The May 1967 Jews are outraged by the fact that 50 years after the Six-Day War, 70 years after the Shoah, the Jewish people is still arguing the legitimacy of its right to exist. The bar has been set so low for what is regarded in the international community as pro-Israel that merely supporting Israel's right to exist is considered pro-Israel. I spoke recently to a group of European journalists who were visiting Israel, and one of them said to me, I'm pro-Israel. I support Israel's right to exist. And I said, I'm pro-Europe. I support Europe's right to exist. And they, of course, laughed, but a little bit nervously, because they understood, perhaps, the absurdity of the special category that Israel inhabits. And so May 1967 Jews carry this wound, this outrage at the fact that our existence is still on the table, that when we negotiate with our neighbors, the concession that we wait for is an acknowledgement of our right to exist, our legitimacy. And that is maddening for the May 1967 sensibility. The anguish of the June 67 Jews is, how is it possible, not only that we are ruling another people for the last 50 years, but that we've gotten used to it, that this is somehow the natural condition for the state of Israel. Jews traditionally identified themselves. Our favorite way of describing who is a Jew was not according to halakha, but it was Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim, merciful children of merciful parents. That was the normative Jewish self-identification for centuries. How is it possible that there is so little anguish, seeming anguish, in Israel today over the ongoing occupation? And so the anguish of the June 67 Jews is over the absence of acute anguish in Israel. The paradox of 1967 is that on the one hand, it empowered the Jewish people in a way that I believe we have never been empowered before in our history. It not only empowered the state of Israel, but it empowered the diaspora. It empowered Soviet Jewry, the fact that we have 1.5 million Jews from the former Soviet Union in Israel, and you have something like 750,000 immigrants here, is a direct result of the transformation of a generation of young Soviet Jews that happened in the Six-Day War. And a similar transformation, I believe, happened to American Jewry. I was at Policy Conference recently, at AIPAC Policy Conference, and I was frankly stunned at the self-confident projection of power that AIPAC manages. And I saw the demonstration of, there were a few hundred young people from the anti-AIPAC group, If Not Now. And I thought how they too are a product of the Six-Day War's empowerment, even though they don't realize it. The fact that young Jews can demonstrate against Jewish power is in itself an expression of how confident the Jewish people has become as a direct gift of the Six-Day War. And initially, at least, what American Jewry loved about Israel was Israel's power. I remember, and many of you here may remember, the most popular poster among American Jews in 1967. Anyone remember? The Chassid. The Chassid going into a phone booth and opening up his bekisha, and there's a Superman costume underneath. Never mind that the Haredim didn't serve in the army. Nevertheless, that was the image that American Jews hung up in their dorm rooms in 1967, the image of transformation, of power. In my doctor's office in Flatbush in 1967, there was a floor-to-ceiling poster of Moshe Dayan. This is a doctor's waiting room. And what was so extraordinary about this is that nobody thought it was unusual. Dr. Stuczynski is putting up Moshe Dayan. Of course he is. It's Flatbush, and it's 1967. And so that was then. As the decades progressed and we began to realize the complexity of the consequences of 1967, and especially the question of the Palestinians, the question that we began to ask ourselves is, who are the Palestinians in relation to us? The Palestinians are a profoundly disorienting enemy for the Jews, precisely because of their powerlessness. If they were powerful, we would have a much easier time navigating this conflict. And so who are the Palestinians? On the one hand, are they the strangers in our midst whom we are forbidden to persecute? On the other hand, are they the enemy in our gates who seek to disinherit us, the counterclaim negating our legitimacy? And so these contradictory roles that the Palestinians play in Jewish imagination, and not just in our imagination, very much in our reality, has disoriented us, thrown us off balance. And this brings me back to this bipolarity in our relationship to power. The powerlessness of the Palestinians have touched the deepest place of bipolarity in the Jewish psyche. As a consequence of that, one of the profoundly negative consequences of 1967 is that our relationship to power and the Palestinian conflict have resurrected a deep political immaturity within the Jewish people. Zionism set out to teach the Jews how to re-inhabit the real world, how to navigate the great powers, how to deal with the situation on the ground, to teach us realism. This was not an easy task. Of all of the hard tasks that Zionism set out for itself, to return the Jewish people to its land, resurrect Hebrew, empower the Jews militarily, to teach the Jews the wisdom, the practical wisdom of power, was one of the most difficult. This is a people that for centuries had no real relationship to power, and so had developed very childish ideas about how the world works. We were a Luftmensch people. And the most blatant expression of that was the mass Jewish attraction in the early 20th century to communism, which for many Jews today is still somehow seen as, there's still this kind of nostalgia that somehow that was an expression of tikkun olam, of what was good about the Jewish people, rather than seeing the mass attraction of Jews for Stalinism, because that is what it turned out to be, as something, as an expression of a profound imbalance in our understanding of power, in our understanding of how the world works. Our attraction to utopian communism was not our finest moment. And so Zionism comes along, and together with the Holocaust, we seem to have finally crossed the threshold back into being a people that is capable of dealing with the real world. 1967 upends that for both the right and the left. For the right, the messianic fervor that grips religious Zionism in 1967 and lasts for several decades, I would argue that it has significantly waned in recent years, but certainly through the 70s and the 80s, this profound messianic excitation creates a mentality within the settlement camp in which one doesn't have to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. When I was researching the settlement movement for Like Dreamers, I searched in vain for some record of a serious deliberation among settlement leaders about what their plan was, what were they going to do about the presence of 1 million and then 2 million Palestinians in their midst. There was not a single serious conversation that I could find in the history of the settlement movement about what to do, what is the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Issues, warnings that the Israeli left raised in the summer of 1967, immediately after the war. Amos Oz and others are writing op-eds warning that an occupation is going to be a disaster for the occupiers, and that we are in deep trouble in terms of navigating the Jewish and democratic identities of Israel. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said, "What am I going to do with the Palestinians?" The question was never seriously asked among the settlement leaders, and again, for a simple reason. If the Messiah is about to come, if this really is the Messianic era, or if one wants to take a more moderate position, God is in our victory, in our return to the land, whether the Messiah is imminent or not, then God will worry about it, or the Messiah will worry about it. We don't have to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions, and that is a profoundly anti-Zionist approach to reality. On the left, we see a different process, a different form of messianism that set in, and it's embarrassing for the left to be reminded of the 1990s. But in the 1990s, there was widespread sentiment among the Israeli left and the diaspora Jewish left that we are on the verge of a new Middle East. Remember that one? The new Middle East. Well, we have a new Middle East, and it's Syria, Iraq, Yemen, That's okay. That's great. Thank you. Okay. So on the right, we hear a denial of the most basic reality. There's no such thing as an occupation. I hear that all the time when I speak to right-wing groups, especially in this country. And not only is there no such thing as an occupation of the Palestinians, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. They're a contrived people, an invented people. To which my response is, of course they're an invented people. That's the definition of peoplehood. Every people is an invented people. The question only is, at what point does a group of random people invent themselves into peoplehood? We did it, every people does it. On the left, there's a different set of denial. First, the denial of just how deep the rejection of Israel's legitimacy is in all parts of the Palestinian national movement. And this has gotten the left into repeated trouble from the 1990s onward. There is also a profound minimization of the threats that Israel faces. I think of the name If Not Now, this new organization demanding the creation of a Palestinian state now. Even Israelis like myself, who support a two-state solution because we need a two-state solution, do not want a two-state solution right now. This notion of now strikes an Israeli sensibility as frankly ludicrous. I understand settlement freeze now, but a Palestinian state now? And it's not my topic. One can go on about why not now. But certainly most of Israelis would find that name as absurd in its way as the name, frankly, Peace Now. Now, 1967 had one more destructive consequence in the Jewish people's relationship to power, and that is that it helped resurrect certain destructive Jewish archetypes which we had believed had disappeared into Jewish history, and that are expressions in the most pathological way of a Jewish imbalance in our relationship to power. On the right, we are seeing the resurrection of the Second Temple era zealots. We are seeing the resurrection of that force which assassinated rival political leaders as the Romans besieged Jerusalem, which burned the storerooms full of grain in besieged Jerusalem, because those were storerooms belonging to a rival political camp. We are seeing the return of a form of madness entering into Jewish politics. And on the right, on the left, we're seeing the resurrection of pre-Holocaust anti-Zionism, which many of us had assumed had disappeared as a result of the Holocaust. As it turned out, those forms of anti-Zionism were only temporarily dormant. The only forms of anti-Zionism that seemed to survive the Holocaust were on the ultra-Orthodox in the ultra-Orthodox camp, Satmar Neturei Karta. Today we are seeing the resurrection of something like the anti-Zionist Bund or the anti-Zionist Jewish communists, or for that matter, something of the classical reform anti-Zionism in a new guise in different parts of the Jewish community. And most of all, we are seeing the resurrection of a particularly odious type of Jewish archetype, and that is the Jew who feels the need to publicly repudiate his or her people in order to prove one's moral standing. The British Jewish novelist Howard Jacobson lampooned this tendency in his book, The Finkler Question, where he invented an organization of left-wing Jews called Proud to be Ashamed. Now, the second transformation that I'd like to speak about is our relationship to power, to land, and to the wholeness of the land of Israel, and how the Six-Day War resurrected this temptation for wholeness, for physical wholeness. Pre-1967 Israel was a very strange country. It did not have a single significant Jewish holy site. Now, think about that for a moment. There were graves of rabbis, but there was not any one major holy site. In that sense, pre-67 Israel, the landscape itself seemed to confirm the secular Zionist goal of divorcing Israeli identity from religiosity and really from 2,000 years of Jewish longing and diaspora culture. In those years, the culture war that divided Israel in the years before 1967 was fought between two camps that I would only half ironically call the Israelis versus the Jews. And the Israelis believed that Israel, the state of Israel, was a new construct. We were divorcing ourselves, certainly from 2,000 years of Jewish history, and really from 4,000 years of a sacred self-definition of the Jewish people. The Jews believed that the state of Israel was an organic continuity of all 4,000 years of Jewish history. The moment when the Jews win, and I believe that the Jews have decisively won the culture war in Israel today, there's no longer a question of the centrality of Jewishness and even of Judaism in Israeli identity. The only question is what kind of Judaism, and that's a very, very important question. But the old culture war between the Israelis and the Jews was lost by the Israelis, and this we realize only in retrospect, on June 7th, 1967, when the paratroopers reached the wall. And the most secular Israelis, the kibbutznik paratroopers, many of them throw themselves against the wall and in effect surrender their Israeliness to something much larger and deeper. The settlement movement that arises immediately after the Six-Day War is a convergence of seemingly irresistible forces. First of all, the way we returned to that land in a war of self-defense against attempted genocide. The power of the claim, both on religious and historic basis. And I'm Natan Alterman, one of Israel's most beloved poets, a man of labor Zionism, who after the Six-Day War founds the movement for the complete land of Israel. Natan Alterman writes a seminal piece in 1968 saying, what other people in the world knows the precise graves of its ancient founders? And said, there is no people in the world that would walk away from Hebron. And so there is that irresistible pull combined with very powerful security arguments. How do we go back to the borders that were so tempting to our neighbors as a springboard to try to destroy us? Most of all, there was the question of God's presence in this story, certainly for the settlement movement. If we return to the land through an act of divine will, how dare we express ingratitude to God? And this is exactly the language that the settlement movement used in its early years. Giving up the land would be an act of ingratitude to God. And the settlement movement issued a proclamation that no one generation has the right to speak for all the generations of Jews. This is land that belongs to all the generations, past, present, and future, to all of the souls that have not yet incarnated. And so there was this sense of we are the custodians of this land. We have no right to negotiate and treat the land as political real estate. Now, there were religious attempts to counter this argument. The best known was from Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the former Sephardi chief rabbi, who ruled that for the sake of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives, one is permitted to withdraw from territory. But there's a deeper religious justification for withdrawal, which comes out of the holiness of the land itself. And these are ideas that really developed in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall of the Hartman Institute, Rabbi David Hartman and the circle around him in the 70s, the 80s, who pointed to the sanctity of the land as precisely the reason for why we are permitted to share the land with another people and why we are forbidden to remain permanent occupiers. Because sacred land cannot actually be owned by human beings. We are, in fact, custodians. And Shemitah, every 7 years when the land is left fallow, and that applies only to the land of Israel, is an expression of how one cannot actually own the Holy Land. And so, if this conditionality in our relationship to the land is what really expresses our presence there, then if we find ourselves in the impossible circumstances in which we find ourselves today, and not only don't I minimize the holiness of the land, but it's precisely because I affirm the holiness of the land that I find myself in the very painful position of supporting its redivision. But in supporting partition of the land, I think that it is essential for us at the same time, and this is the paradox of our relationship to the land, it is essential for us to reaffirm our legitimate presence in the land, at least in theory, that we are, in fact, legitimate custodians of this land. And so the paradox is that in order to partition the land, we need to first insist on our right to the totality of this land. And I believe that because I see the conceptual basis for supporting partition is that there are two peoples in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, each of which can make a compelling claim based on its own self-understanding for why the totality of this land belongs to them. Seen in that way, the land between the river and the sea is actually two conceptual territories. It is the land of Israel and the land of Palestine. I do not believe that the Jewish people is an occupier in Judea. It is our land as much as that land can be anyone's. But there is another people in that land, and I need to come to terms with their claim. There are three positions, essentially, in Israeli society today in relation to the land. The first, on the left, and I would say that this is really on the farther left, is that this is occupied territory. It doesn't belong to us, and we have no legitimate claim to it. The second, on the right, and this is a normative right-wing position, is that it's liberated territory. And then there's the position, and this is my position, that it is both simultaneously. It is we are legitimately in that land, but we are occupying another people there. And so, in order for partition to succeed, each side needs to contract its legitimate claim to the totality of the land. You know, when Palestinians display a map in their schools or in their newspapers that show the whole of the land as Palestine without Israel mentioned, I personally am not offended. And the reason for that is because my internal map does not show the word Palestine. Palestine does not exist on my map. This is the land of Israel. But for the sake of compromise, peace, honoring the sacredness of the land, I need to, again, contract what is legitimately mine in order to accommodate the counterclaimant. And I think that one of the mistakes, fatal mistakes, that the Jewish left makes is in not insisting on our theoretical right to the totality of this land, if only because the Palestinians with whom we will negotiate have no compunction about insisting on their claim to the totality of the land. Shnaim ochzin betalit, the Mishnah, two people are holding a garment. One says it's all mine, the other says it's all mine. You divide the garment. One says it's all mine, the other says it's half mine. The one who says it's half mine gets a quarter. If only for negotiating purposes, we need to affirm our legitimate claim, though I do believe that we need to affirm our claim for much deeper reasons than just tactical. The third factor, and I think we have about 10 minutes left. I will try to speak about the Jewish people and God in 10 minutes. And my starting point is a personal memory. And that is my father in the summer of 1967. My father emerged from the Shoah refusing to pray to God. He had come from quite an Orthodox family. His family was close to Satmar in Transylvania, close to the Satmar Rebbe. And my father's conclusion from the Holocaust was that God does not deserve Jewish prayer. Now, I like that response very much. And the reason is it's a very Jewish response, because what my father was saying is not that he doesn't believe in God because of the Holocaust. Of course he believes in God. God is God. God is all-powerful. Because God is all-powerful, he could have stopped the Holocaust and chose not to. Therefore, Jews should not pray to him. Very practical, very much of a personal arrangement with God. In the summer of 1967, my father is at the wall, and he says, now I can forgive God. God is acting like God again, is protecting the Jewish people, and I can forgive him, and I can pray again. And he, in fact, became a devout Jew in his last years. And here again, there's something very Jewish in that process. The Yiddish poet Jacob Gladstein wrote, in Sinai, we received the Torah. In Lublin, we gave it back. And so my father, in the summer of 1967, was saying, well, if we could reject God because of his seeming faithlessness to the Jewish people, then it only makes sense that we can reconcile with him once he returned to us as a faithful keeper of the covenant. And what my father was really saying is that the God of the Bible had returned. The God of split waters, the God of miracles, the God who acts overtly in history. We had seen in the summer in 1967 the end of Hester Panim, the seeming end of the eclipse of God's face. Now, I'd like to take this idea just a little bit deeper, because it's a very tricky theological notion of God and history, judging God's faithfulness through what happens to the Jewish people in history. But it is an idea that I believe we cannot avoid, because Judaism itself has set this dynamic up. Judaism does not look for proof of God's presence in nature. Judaism looks for proof of God's presence in history, and more specifically, in Jewish history. And so the open question that Jews were confronted with in 1945 is, would the Shoah stand as the most powerful mythic moment in Jewish history since the revelation at Sinai? Now, Sinai was too distant an event for many Jews to still have that mythic potency to challenge the Shoah. In the end, it was only the resurrection of Jewish sovereignty, the return to the land of Israel, that had the mythic force, if not to negate the Shoah, but to resurrect Sinai as a counterweight to the Shoah. And if you look at my father's story, I think you will see in something that really reverberated throughout the Jewish people in the summer of 67 with lasting consequences. And that is that faith in God becomes possible again for many Jews. Now, I'm not saying this in any definitive way, but the fact that the Shoah is no longer the most powerful mythic moment in modern Jewish history, but has a counterweight in what I would argue is a no less powerful mythic moment, the rise of Israel and the empowerment of Israel, makes it possible for Jews like my father to doubt God's faithlessness. My father, who had doubted God's faithfulness, is now questioning whether it's right to doubt God's faithlessness. And that opens the way for a return of God into the Jewish people. Why didn't it happen in 1948? I think there are several reasons. One is 1948 was too close to the Shoah. The shock was still too raw. And a very credible argument could have been made, and was in fact made, by secular Zionists, which is that Israel exists because the Jews stopped waiting for God's intervention. It exists because of secular empowerment. And so that really is where I would say the Jewish people related to the story of Israel until 1967. 1967 is the moment where our certainty that God is not in this story, in the story of the state of Israel, suddenly becomes upended. And we begin, some of us, many of us perhaps, begin asking ourselves the question, might God be in this story after all? Now, the danger, of course, in bringing God into the story of a secular state is invoking God, using God as legitimacy for our own secular political purposes. But I believe that to some extent, with all the danger, and we need to face that danger with open eyes, I believe, again, that the logic of Judaism makes this process to some extent unavoidable. You cannot carry a fantasy, a dream for 2,000 years, a dream that seems so inconceivable of the Jews returning from the four corners to the land of Israel, a dream that is so fantastic that only the Messiah can deliver this dream in Jewish imagination. You carry this dream for 2,000 years. It is then fulfilled under the most fantastic, literally fantastic circumstances, unimaginable circumstances. And you can't then expect this people to not at least ask the question of, is God in this story and to what extent? The question is, which God? Is it the God of the Bible, the God who performs miracles, who upends history? Is it the God of the rabbis, a more hidden God, a more modest God? Is it the God of the Kabbalists and the Hasidim, the God of the mystics, the God of a personal relationship, the God of whom one can aspire to actually know in this life, the living God in one's own personal experience? And to some extent, I would say that that question of which God has returned to the Jewish people as a result of 1967 is one of the seminal issues being debated in Israel today, certainly in the religious communities. And the question of which God we embrace, which God returns, will to some extent help determine how we navigate the uses of power and resolve our anguished dilemmas over the future of the land that we won in 1967. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yossi. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Wolf. I work for the Shalom Hartman Institute, and we are delighted to be partnering with the JCC in Manhattan on this program today, and delighted to welcome you all into our environments. We're looking to create an open and pluralistic conversation about issues of Jewish identity and peoplehood and ethics and theology as we started this morning, as they relate to Zionism, nationalism, land, sovereignty, Jerusalem, occupation, and our own moral red lines. The structure for the rest of the day includes a couple of things. We have a number of different modalities of learning that we're going to be including today, including open sessions like this, as well as some smaller seminars and panel discussions. If you look at the inside of your brochures, of your program books, there are 2 breakout sessions that are now going to be sort of as the core part of the day. Programs in the Beit Midrash and in the library are on the 7th floor of the JCC. We have dedicated the far right elevator to be an express, think of it as the 2-3, to go directly up to the 7th floor for those of you who want to go up to one of the breakout sessions there. The auditorium breakout sessions will happen here in this room, so we invite you to take a look and see with the myriad of topics that we've chosen to populate this conference, which one you'd like to participate. We've got a pretty quick turnaround time to pack everything in that we wanted to pack in for the day, but we ask you not to run over people as you make your way to the exits. A couple of things. There will be food available out here outside of this room in the auditorium throughout the course of the day, and dinner will be served in this room as well. And for those of you who are tweeting or making comments on Facebook, please remember our hashtag 6days50years, as well as the people who are watching on live stream right now. So I ask you to, in an orderly fashion, figure out where you want to go next, and we look forward to spending this day and learning with you.